Freeman County, Virginia, had always been a town where everyone knew everyone, where the past clung to the land like the stubborn fog rolling over the hills in the early morning. In 1968, the town was still recovering from the chaos of the civil rights movement, and its residents, though many denied it, were divided on matters of race, power, and privilege. The veins of segregation and mistrust ran deep, like old roots winding through the heart of the community. But no one could have anticipated the seismic shift that was about to hit this small southern town. It started with the Randolphs. Anne and Leslie Randolph were pillars of the local elite, wealthy landowners whose plantation home was a testament to the old world. Tall columns, manicured gardens, and walls steeped in the kind of history that only money and legacy could buy. Their family had been in Freeman County for generations, with their wealth tied to the very soil beneath them. Leslie was a war hero of the Second World War, his name etched in the local papers more than once for his charitable works and his political influence. Anne, his dutiful wife, was the picture of Southern grace, soft-spoken yet commanding, with a steely gaze that could silence a room. They were a family everyone respected, or feared, depending on whom you asked. But that respect crumbled overnight when their lifeless bodies were found sprawled in the drawing room of their home on a damp Wednesday morning. The news spread like wildfire, and by the time the sun set, it was all anyone could talk about. The shock was palpable in every corner of Freeman County, yet it wasn't just the deaths that had people talking. It was the circumstances surrounding them. Anne and Leslie Randolph had been brutally murdered, their throats slit in a manner so cold and calculated it left the entire town reeling. At first, the authorities were tight-lipped, but it didn't take long before the rumors started to surface. A few hours later, whispers flooded the streets. Jerome Washington, a black man who had worked as a gardener and handyman for the Randolphs for years, had been seen fleeing the property on the night of the murders. Jerome, a war veteran who had returned from Vietnam just a year earlier, was suddenly the prime suspect. No one knew for sure what had happened, but the pieces fell into place too easily. He had been in the wrong place at the wrong time. A black man in a town still haunted by racial divides, with a history that had been stained by hatred and violence. His guilt was assumed before the facts were even gathered. Jack Lee, a 33-year-old lawyer and Freeman County native, wasn't prepared for what the murder case would do to him. He'd always been a part of the town's establishment, raised by parents who carried the weight of old Southern values. His father, Frank, was a respected man in the community, a successful farmer with his own deep-rooted opinions about how things should be. His mother, Hilly, was a quiet, methodical woman who took pride in her place in the town's hierarchy. Jack had grown up knowing his place, understanding the lines that separated people based on race, class, and history. But when news of the Randolphs' murder reached him, a small, rebellious voice inside him stirred. He couldn't ignore it. The case was more than just a senseless killing. It was a collision of two worlds, a test of the very foundation on which Freeman County had been built. The temptation to act, to challenge the status quo, gnawed at him. But the real test came when Jack made the decision to defend Jerome Washington. The moment Jack walked into the Randolph mansion to meet with the sheriff, the air was thick with tension. The grand house, now tainted by bloodshed, seemed to mock the idea of peace and order. The Randolphs were gone, their legacy stained with murder, and yet the town, with its divided loyalties, demanded answers. Some wanted justice, some wanted vengeance. And there were those who already knew what they believed. Jerome was guilty. As Jack stood in that house, surrounded by officers, townspeople, and reporters, he knew something had changed forever. The scandal of the Randolphs' murder would haunt Freeman County for years, its consequences felt by every person who called it home. Jack's decision to represent Jerome, an innocent man he believed, would be the first step into a moral battleground, one that would challenge everything he'd ever known. The scandal had only just begun, and Freeman County would never be. Chapter 2. The Rebel Lawyer's Dangerous Gamble. The decision came swiftly, without hesitation, and without the luxury of a second thought. For Jack Lee, there was no turning back once he made up his mind. The courthouse was alive with chatter, a mix of anticipation, judgment, and barely concealed outrage. Word had already spread that Jack Lee, the son of two of Freeman County's most respected citizens, had agreed to take on the defense of Jerome Washington, help the accused murderer of the Randolphs. It was a gamble, a reckless one, a dangerous one. But Jack had always been a man of impulse, a man who questioned the rigidity of the world around him. Though born and raised in the very heart of Freeman County, he had always been a bit of an outsider, never fully conforming to the rules that kept the town's power structures in place. The rebellious streak in him, though carefully hidden for most of his life, was now emerging with a vengeance. His decision did not sit well with the majority. His parents, Frank and Hilly, who had raised him to respect tradition, were horrified. They had always taught Jack the importance of keeping the peace, maintaining the status quo. Frank, in particular, felt the sting of his son's defiance more than anyone. As a man who had built his wealth through years of hard work, Frank despised anything that threatened to disrupt the delicate social order of the South. "Do you know what you're doing, Jack?" Frank's voice, low and filled with disapproval, had echoed through their living room when Jack had revealed his decision. "You're stepping into a fire, and there's no way you'll come out unscathed. That boy's guilty. Everyone knows it." "I don't care what anyone knows, Pa. This is about what's right, not what's easy," Jack had replied, his voice steady but tinged with the passion he was trying to keep contained. His father's sharp eyes narrowed, and the room seemed to grow smaller, more suffocating. "You're just a lawyer, Jack. You don't know what it's like. You don't know the people here, the way they think. You're playing with fire, and it's going to burn you." His mother, Hilly, had been silent. Her expression unreadable as always, she simply looked at him with a sorrowful gaze that made Jack feel like he had betrayed her in ways he couldn't explain. Hilly was the silent force behind the Lee family, and in her silence, Jack felt the weight of her disappointment. But Jack was already past them, past their fears, past their warnings. He had long ago buried the part of himself that could be satisfied with doing things the easy way, and he wasn't about to resurrect it now. The gamble wasn't just personal. It wasn't just about stepping into an arena where public opinion had already sentenced Jerome to death. It was about something much bigger. A challenge to a community that had spent decades, centuries perhaps, built on division, injustice, and unspoken rules that kept people like Jerome at the bottom. The gamble, as dangerous as it was, represented an opportunity to break the cycle. It represented a chance to fight back against a system that had, for too long, kept people in their place. Jack could feel that fire burning in him, stronger than any fear his father had instilled. But the reality of what he had just committed to hit him when he stood alone in his office that night, staring at the case files on his desk. The weight of what he was about to take on seemed more suffocating now that the initial rush of rebellion had worn off. There was no going back. He was going to face the full brunt of a system that didn't just favor the powerful, it worshipped them. In the days that followed, the town made its feelings clear. Whispers followed Jack everywhere he went. The disdain was palpable in every glance, every murmur behind his back. Even the most casual encounters became tense. People avoided him in the grocery store. His colleagues at the law firm barely spoke to him, and the streets seemed to carry an air of suspicion that weighed down his every step. But the most telling reaction came from the local sheriff, a man named Earl Watkins, who had known Jack's family for years. Watkins was the embodiment of the status quo in Freeman County, a man who believed in law and order as long as it kept things in their rightful place. And for him, the line was clear. Black men did not murder white families. They didn't even belong in the same courtroom as their betters. "Lee," Sheriff Watkins said, his voice thick with disdain when he finally cornered Jack one morning, "you're walking a dangerous path. You're about to make a lot of enemies. And the thing is, you won't just be fighting for a man's freedom. You'll be fighting for your own. You keep going down this road, and there's no telling how far this will go. No one in this town will forget that you chose to defend him." Jack didn't flinch. "I'm not fighting for anyone, but what's right, Sheriff. If that's a problem for you, then maybe you need to take a long look at the laws you're upholding." The sheriff's eyes flashed with anger, but he said nothing more. Jack knew what that look meant. It meant there were dangers he couldn't see, forces working in the shadows that would rise up to meet him. Yet Jack was undeterred. He'd never felt more certain of anything in his life. But it wasn't just the town's resistance he had to worry about. Word of Jack's decision had spread quickly to a far more powerful source. Desiree Dubose, a fierce lawyer from Chicago with ties to the NAACP. She had arrived in Freeman County, drawn by the case's potential for national attention. The news of a black man accused of murdering a prominent white family was too explosive to ignore, and Desiree knew that if Jerome was to have any real chance at justice, she had to step in. Jack didn't trust her at first. She was an outsider, a stranger with an agenda he didn't fully understand. But when Desiree made it clear that she was prepared to back him, he realized they were in this together. Two rebels in a town that would tear them apart if they weren't careful. Her arrival was a sign of just how high the stakes had become. Now they were on the same side, but every step they took would put them in greater danger. Jack had gambled everything: his career, his place in the town, his reputation, all for a man he believed was innocent. The game had begun, and the rules were being rewritten. Freeman County would never be. Chapter 3. The Arrival of the Fearless Outsider. The day Desiree Dubose arrived in Freeman County, the skies had darkened, as though the heavens themselves had decided to weigh in on the storm that was brewing below. The small Virginia town, set in its ways, did not take kindly to outsiders, especially those who brought with them the promise of change. The streets were already charged with tension from the aftermath of the Randolph murder, and the arrival of a black lawyer from Chicago only served to stoke the fires of unease. Desiree had known what kind of reception she would receive when she stepped off the train that morning. Chicago was a world away from Freeman County, but for her, the case had become personal. The murder of Anne and Leslie Randolph wasn't just a story to be told. It was a symbol, a flashpoint in a battle much larger than just a single trial. The system that had wronged Jerome Washington had wronged countless others like him, and Desiree was determined to fight it. She had grown up in the rough neighborhoods of South Chicago, where injustice wasn't a distant concept, but an everyday reality. Desiree had witnessed firsthand the corrosive effects of racial inequality, of people like Jerome who were scapegoated and crushed beneath a system that had no regard for their lives. The NAACP had called her when the Randolph case came to light, and from the moment she read the papers, she knew she had to go. She was fearless, sharp, and more than ready for the battle ahead. But more than anything, she was driven by the sense that something bigger than her own career was at stake. This was a fight for justice, for the soul of a country still grappling with its own demons. When Desiree stepped into the local courthouse, all eyes were on her. The stares were instantaneous, cold, and unforgiving. She didn't flinch. The whispers that followed her as she moved through the corridors didn't bother her either. She had long since learned to block out the noise. What mattered now was the courtroom and the man she was here to defend. Jack Lee, already entrenched in the case, was not quite prepared for what Desiree represented. He had assumed, rather naively, that his own legal skills and determination could carry the day. But Desiree was something different. Something he hadn't accounted for. She was everything Jack wasn't. She was bold in ways he had never allowed himself to be, outspoken in ways that made his own approach seem almost cautious. Her presence was an immediate force to be reckoned with, and it wasn't long before their partnership, strained at first, began to take shape. Jack watched her as she walked into the courtroom the first time. Her stride was deliberate, unwavering. Desiree was a woman on a mission, a woman who had come to challenge the very fabric of what Freeman County stood for. The townspeople, many of whom had never seen a black woman in such a position of power, were stunned into silence. It wasn't just her skin color that made her stand out. It was her sheer confidence, her refusal to back down, her command of the space. Her reputation preceded her. Desiree Dubose wasn't just another attorney. She was one of the brightest legal minds of her generation, and her involvement in the case made it clear that the stakes had just been raised. From the start, her presence stirred the pot. The old Southern traditions of Freeman County had always demanded that black people know their place, especially when it came to matters of power, influence, and most significantly, the courtroom. Desiree's entrance into that arena, as an equal to Jack Lee, set the stage for a clash that was both personal and political. Jack was skeptical at first. His natural instinct had always been to work alone, to take control of a case in his own way. But as Desiree confidently took her seat beside him, he couldn't help but feel the gravity of what she brought to the table. She was a seasoned strategist, her mind sharp as a blade, and she didn't mince words when it came to the reality of the case. "You're not just fighting for Jerome, Jack," Desiree said one evening as they reviewed the case files together. "You're fighting for a system that has failed him and countless others. We're not here to just clear his name. We're here to expose the rot beneath the surface. We're here to dismantle a system that has been built on lies." Jack looked at her, taken aback by the intensity of her words. "You're asking for a lot," he replied. "The people here, they won't let us get away with this. You know that, right?" Desiree leaned in, her gaze unwavering. "They won't have a choice but to listen. But first, we have to make them." It was a philosophy Jack didn't fully understand at that moment, but something about it stirred something deep inside him. Desiree wasn't here just to win a trial. She was here to shake the very foundations of the system. And that was exactly what this town needed, whether they knew it or not. However, not everyone shared Jack's admiration for Desiree's boldness. In fact, many in Freeman County saw her as an outsider, a threat to their way of life. Her very presence was an affront to the town's delicate equilibrium, and soon enough, it became clear that the animosity toward her wouldn't just be confined to the courtroom. A week after Desiree's arrival, the first act of intimidation came. A brick was hurled through the window of the small office she had rented. It shattered the glass, the heavy thud of the impact echoing through the empty street. A note was pinned to the brick with a knife. "Go home, or the next one's for you." Desiree wasn't shaken. She had seen worse. She was used to being the target of hate, to being the embodiment of everything the old guard feared. But Jack, who had grown up in this town, couldn't help but feel the weight of the hostility that was now aimed squarely at them both. Still, Desiree took it in stride. Her response was simple, but firm. She would not leave. "We knew it was coming," she said calmly, looking out at the wreckage of the window. "This is nothing compared to what we're going to face in that courtroom. The question is, are we ready for it?" Jack didn't have an answer. But in that moment, he knew that this fight had just become much bigger than a murder trial. This was no longer just about Jerome Washington. It was about the very fabric of the country, about the ideals it claimed to uphold, and the lies it had lived by. And Desiree DuBose was here to make sure the truth would be heard, no matter the cost. Chapter 4. A Trial Rigged from the Start. From the moment the courthouse doors swung open for the trial, Jack Lee knew that the odds were stacked against them. Despite the monumental stakes, the trial seemed like an afterthought to many in Freeman County. To the locals, the truth had already been decided. Jerome Washington, a black man, had murdered two of the town's most respected white citizens. It didn't matter that he had served his country in Vietnam, or that his reputation among the Randolphs had been spotless. He was guilty simply because he didn't belong in the same social sphere as the victims. The courthouse was a pressure cooker, with tensions simmering beneath every surface. Outside, the air was thick with hostility, and the local townsfolk gathered in small clusters, gossiping and glaring at anyone they deemed out of place. The press, mostly local, documented every moment with the same unwavering bias that had already condemned Jerome before a single piece of evidence was presented. Jack's job was now a tightrope walk between justice and survival. He had never been naive, but even he had underestimated how deeply the rot had spread through the system. From the very beginning, it became clear that this trial was a farce, rigged from the start to ensure a guilty verdict. The sheriff, Earl Watkins, had made his position clear when he'd warned Jack. "There's no point in dragging this out. The people here won't stand for it." The first blow came with the choice of Judge Daniel Hughes, an old-timer who had been serving in Freeman County for decades. He was a man known for his biases, especially when it came to cases involving black defendants. Hughes had made his disdain for Jerome public before the trial even began, calling the charges straightforward and uncomplicated. His favoritism toward the prosecution was evident in his actions from the very first moments of the trial. He ruled swiftly and harshly on every motion Jack filed, always siding with the prosecution and dismissing any request for a fair examination of the evidence. During pretrial hearings, Judge Hughes had denied Jack's request for an independent forensic analysis of the crime scene. "We already have the best experts in the state," he had said with a dismissive wave, as if the idea of questioning their findings was an affront to the court's integrity. His ruling was a blow to the defense team, but it wasn't surprising. Hughes had never hidden his feelings about the case. Jack wasn't alone in his fight, but Desiree's presence, though powerful, only seemed to make things worse. The town had already rejected her, viewing her as a meddler from the outside, and her reputation as a strong, outspoken woman only fueled the fire. As the trial progressed, local authorities made their feelings clear through subtle, yet ominous acts of intimidation. The courtroom was often tense, with some jurors barely concealing their prejudice, their expressions cold and unforgiving. Every word Desiree spoke was met with huffs of disdain from the more conservative members of the jury. Her attempts to challenge the prosecution's case were immediately shot down, and any attempts to present mitigating circumstances for Jerome's actions seemed to fall on deaf ears. But it wasn't just the judge and jury Jack had to contend with. It was the seasoned prosecutor, Michael Hartwell, who was determined to see Jerome convicted at all costs. Hartwell had grown up in Freeman County, and his political ambitions were as deeply tied to the town's power structure as any old family. He knew that this trial could make or break his career. To him, the truth didn't matter. His conviction rate did. Jerome's life was just another stepping stone in a system that had been built on the backs of the oppressed. Hartwell's tactics were as sharp as they were unscrupulous. Early in the trial, he introduced a narrative that would stick with the jury like glue. Jerome was a violent man, a ticking time bomb, capable of murder without remorse. The very idea that Jerome, a black man, could have been driven to kill two respected white citizens was framed not as a tragic misunderstanding, but as an inevitability. His defense as a veteran, a man who had fought in Vietnam, was undermined at every turn, dismissed as an excuse for a murderous rampage. Hartwell painted Jerome as a man incapable of restraint, a stereotype that many in the town were all too willing to accept. But it wasn't just the prosecution's portrayal of Jerome that was problematic. It was the attack on Jerome's character, and worse still, the involvement of his wife, Pearl. The prosecution, in a shocking move, introduced a new theory. Jerome hadn't acted alone. In fact, they insinuated that Pearl, his wife, had been complicit in the murders. The idea that a woman, especially a black woman in this town, could be involved in the brutal deaths of two white people was a charge that rattled the community to its core. The accusation was flimsy at best. There was no real evidence linking Pearl to the crime, but that didn't stop Hartwell from weaving a narrative that suggested a dangerous conspiracy. His goal was clear: create doubt in the minds of the jury, sow enough suspicion about Jerome's family ties to ensure their verdict. Jack and Desiree's attempt to counter the prosecution's tactics felt like a losing battle. Despite their best efforts to present Jerome as a victim of circumstance, caught in a system that had already condemned him before he even set foot in the courtroom, nothing they did seemed to move the needle. Even their expert witnesses were dismissed as biased, unqualified, or irrelevant. The judge, to no surprise, supported Hartwell's every move, allowing him to introduce inflammatory evidence and ask leading questions that bordered on harassment. The defense was trapped. Every motion they filed was denied. Every attempt to introduce reasonable doubt was thwarted. And worse yet, the town's resentment for them, particularly Desiree, seeped into every corner of the trial. Their struggle was no longer just in the courtroom. It was a fight for their very safety. On one occasion, as Desiree and Jack exited the courthouse, a group of local men, eyes narrowed, mouths set in grim lines, stood in their path. One of them spat on the ground, a clear warning. They said nothing, but their stares spoke volumes. The threat was implicit, and it hung over Jack's head as he walked away. As the days wore on, the trial became less about the facts and more about who could control the narrative. The town had already made up its mind. Jerome was guilty. He was a product of his circumstances, a black man who had crossed the line. The question now wasn't whether he was innocent, but whether Jack and Desiree could pull off a miracle and expose the cracks in a system that had already condemned him. But every moment, every word in that courtroom felt like a nail in the coffin. The trial was rigged from the start, and with each passing day, Jack began to realize just how little control they truly had. The fight wasn't just for Jerome's freedom, it was for a future that, for now, seemed impossible. Chapter 5: Dark Secrets of the Randolph Family. As the trial of Jerome Washington continued to unfold, Jack Lee found himself entangled in a web that went far beyond the confines of the courtroom. What had initially seemed like a straightforward case, an accused man, a heinous crime, and a fractured community, began to morph into something darker, more insidious. With every day that passed, Jack began to unravel secrets of the Randolph family that no one had dared to consider before. It started with the smallest of clues, details that seemed inconsequential in the heat of the trial, but which Jack couldn't shake from his mind. He had always known the Randolphs as a family of wealth and influence. Anne, a gracious lady of high society. Leslie, a respected businessman who kept his distance from the town's more unsavory dealings. But as Jack dug deeper into their lives, he began to realize that the Randolphs were not as immaculate as they appeared. In fact, their carefully cultivated image was built on layers of lies and deceit. The first inkling came when Jack stumbled upon a series of private letters hidden in the Randolphs' estate, which were meant to be nothing more than inconspicuous correspondence between Anne and Leslie. But as Jack pored over the letters, they revealed a troubling pattern. There was talk of mounting debts, of threats from creditors, stories of financial ruin carefully hidden behind the family's carefully curated public facade. Leslie had always been seen as a man in control, but behind closed doors, it seemed he was barely keeping his head above water. The more Jack dug, the more questions arose. It wasn't just money troubles that haunted the Randolphs. Anne's personal diary, which Jack managed to gain access to through an old family friend, detailed an affair, one that had been carefully kept from public view for years. Her lover was someone well known in town, a man who had frequented the Randolph estate under the guise of business dealings, but whose presence had always been dismissed as innocuous. The affair had been brief, but intense, a passionate secret kept hidden from the world, and from Leslie. Anne's confessions were raw and unfiltered, shedding light on a woman who had long felt trapped in her marriage, desperate for an escape from the emotional neglect she had endured. Jack had to confront a harsh reality. The Randolphs, the so-called perfect family, were as fraught with secrets and betrayal as anyone else. And it didn't end with Anne's infidelities. As Jack spent more time in the Randolphs' house, he found other troubling signs, clues that suggested Leslie's dealings were more sinister than they appeared. The most troubling of all came when Jack uncovered evidence suggesting that the Randolphs' wealth wasn't entirely derived from their business ventures. A series of cryptic documents revealed ties to shady land deals, under-the-table transactions with local politicians, and, most alarmingly, associations with the Ku Klux Klan. Jack's stomach turned when he realized that Leslie's business success might have been funded, at least in part, by his dealings with men who trafficked in hate and violence. The Klan, still active in parts of the South, had long operated under a veil of secrecy, but the Randolphs' involvement, whether directly or through their financial investments, was clear. The deeper Jack went, the more tangled the web became, and with every new discovery, the picture of a family built on corruption and cruelty grew sharper. But it wasn't just their financial dealings that Jack had to contend with. There were darker, more intimate secrets that lingered in the shadows of the Randolph household. There were whispers that the family's oldest daughter, Christine, had been the subject of abuse, both physical and emotional. The rumors had been murmured for years, but had never been proven, quickly dismissed by the tight-knit community as the fanciful gossip of a troubled mind. But as Jack pieced together fragments of testimony from former servants and distant relatives, a troubling pattern began to emerge. Christine, a quiet and withdrawn woman who rarely made public appearances, had spent much of her youth isolated in the family home, her life shaped by the oppressive weight of her parents' secrets. The abuse was alleged to have begun when Christine was just a teenager at the hands of her father. It was a difficult accusation to make, one that would turn the already twisted trial into an even more volatile affair, but the evidence, though circumstantial, was hard to ignore. In one particularly damning moment, Jack discovered a letter from Leslie to his wife Anne, in which he referred to discipline that needed to be administered to Christine to ensure she learns her place. The language was chilling, almost clinical, as though the entire situation had been normalized in the Randolph family's home. What Jack couldn't understand was how such a powerful family had managed to hide these atrocities for so long. The town had been blind to their misdeeds, their power too far-reaching, their influence too vast to challenge. It was the perfect cover for a family whose wealth and status had kept them above reproach. But as Jack sifted through the pieces of their dark past, he began to realize that Jerome's trial was not just about a murder. It was about exposing these truths, these demons that had been buried for so long. As Jack dug deeper into the Randolphs' history, he found one last shocking revelation: the connection between the Randolphs and Jerome's own family. Leslie Randolph had long been involved in land deals that had displaced black families, including Jerome's. It was a story that had never been told, the story of how the Randolphs had made their fortune at the expense of people like Jerome's ancestors. The legacy of that violence, that oppression, had persisted for generations, festering just beneath the surface. And now, the cycle had come full circle, with Jerome standing trial for the murder of the very people who had, in part, helped create the system that had oppressed his family for so long. The realization hit Jack hard. The Randolphs weren't just victims of a tragic crime. They were perpetrators, complicit in a system that had systematically destroyed the lives of so many. And though he had come to the trial believing that Jerome Washington was the only one in need of justice, Jack now understood that the real fight was not just for one man's freedom. It was for the truth to come to light, for the entire town to finally face the darkness it had long ignored. The more Jack uncovered, the more he realized how much was at stake, not just for Jerome, but for Freeman County itself. This trial wasn't just about a murder. It was about exposing the lies that had been buried for too long, and Jack was prepared to tear apart the carefully constructed facade of the Randolph family, no matter what it cost him. The stakes had grown too high for anything less. The days following the trial were like a slow, painful unraveling for Jack Lee. Freeman County, once a place of familiar rhythms, now felt like a distant memory. The courthouse, the town square, the old diner where Jack had spent countless hours drinking coffee with his father, they all seemed like relics of a past he could no longer connect with. The victory that had seemed so vital, so necessary, in the courtroom had given way to a lingering sense of disillusionment. Yet amidst the brokenness, amidst the rubble of the trial's aftermath, Jack knew one thing: life had to move on. The town might be fractured, and his personal world might feel like it had crumbled to dust, but there was still work to be done. For him, for Desiree, for the people who had been affected by the events they had uncovered, and most of all, for the memory of his sister Lucy, whose sacrifice had never felt more significant or more painful. Jerome Washington had left town soon after the trial, retreating into the shadows of a world that had betrayed him. Though free, he carried the weight of the years lost to an unjust system, and no victory could undo the damage done to him. The case had been his redemption, but the scars of injustice were not so easily erased. Jack thought of him often. Desiree had returned to Chicago, but not without leaving a mark on Jack. Their bond, forged in the fire of the courtroom, had become something deeper. Though their time together had been brief, their shared struggle had created an unspoken understanding between them. It wasn't just about the trial anymore. It was about what came next, what kind of world they could try to build out of the ashes. But it was Jack's own transformation that loomed largest. The man who had walked into the trial with naive hope had been replaced by someone harder, someone who had seen too much of the world's darkness to believe in easy answers. His idealism, once so unshakable, had been tested and torn apart like paper in a storm. But it wasn't gone entirely. He had learned that justice was not a simple, neat equation. It was messy. It was painful. But it was worth pursuing, no matter the cost. One evening, as the days grew shorter and the air turned crisp with the onset of fall, Jack sat in his father's old office, the room filled with the scent of dust and aged wood. His father had left this place years ago, his retirement marking the end of an era in the town's legal community. Jack had inherited the office, but the legacy it represented was far more complicated now. The door creaked open and Desiree stepped inside, her presence a welcome contrast to the stillness that had consumed the office. Her sharp eyes softened when they met Jack's, as if she, too, could sense the weight that hung between them. She had come back to Freeman County, not as the fierce attorney who had challenged the status quo, but as a woman seeking answers. Answers about what her life would look like in the aftermath of all that had happened. "I thought you might be here," Desiree said, her voice quiet but certain. "You've been avoiding me." Jack stood up, pushing aside the papers that had accumulated on the desk. The familiar weight of his old life, the work, the expectations, the ties to Freeman County, felt like a suffocating blanket. But Desiree's presence was different. She wasn't here to judge or demand. She was here to listen. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice hoarse. "It's just, everything has changed. I thought this would be easier somehow." Desiree nodded, her expression understanding. "I get it. The world doesn't just shift like that without leaving some scars behind. We did what we set out to do, Jack. But now we're left with the aftermath, the fallout." Jack leaned against the desk, his fingers drumming absently against the wood. "I've been thinking a lot about that, about how everything we did, it didn't change anything here. The town's still broken. The people who suffered haven't really been healed. And I don't know if I'm even the same person anymore." Desiree stepped closer, her gaze unwavering. "You're not. But that doesn't mean you've lost yourself. You've changed because you've seen the worst of people and the best. You saw through the lies, you fought for what was right, and you've given a lot more than most would. Now it's time to think about what comes next. What do you want to do with that?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with possibility. What came next? Jack had spent so many years chasing the ideal of justice, but now, after all the pain and loss, he was left with the most difficult question of all. What kind of justice could he truly pursue in a world that felt so flawed? "I don't know," he admitted, his voice quiet. "But I'm not going to stop. I can't. There's still work to do. There are still people who need help. And if I don't do it, who will?" Desiree smiled, a small, knowing curve of her lips. "Exactly. And you're not alone in this. We've both seen what happens when good people sit back and do nothing. But now, maybe we can build something better. Together." Jack looked at her, a sense of clarity beginning to form. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be more battles to fight, more injustices to uncover, more personal sacrifices to make. But in that moment, as Desiree stood beside him, he knew something else. He had found his purpose again. Not through the eyes of the law, not through the courtroom victories, but through the people he had met, the causes he had championed, and the deeper understanding of justice that had been forged in the flames of everything that had happened. In the ashes of Freeman County's destruction, Jack had found something new. A resolve that wasn't about winning or losing, but about continuing to fight for what was right. It wasn't a perfect victory. It wasn't a neat conclusion to the story. But it was a beginning. And that was enough. As Jack walked out of the office with Desiree, the setting sun cast long shadows over the streets of Freeman County, but there was something in the air, something that spoke of hope. It wasn't much, but it was a start. And in that moment, as the town slowly began to rebuild itself, Jack knew that this new beginning was the most important one of all. The fight for justice would never be over, but at least, now, Jack knew he wasn't fighting alone.